After more than 2 years, I decided to do another Q&A video, and I asked you guys what questions you had for me. I didn't want this video to be research heavy, so I could have a bit of a break of sorts. I'm only one person, and I can't answer specific questions about random things that I haven't looked into before. So if I don't include your question, that might be the reason. And also, I didn't bother to check what questions I answered in the last Q&A, so I might repeat some of them here. But anyway, let's get into it. What got you interested in the 1920s? Well, it didn't start with the 1920s. Since I was a kid, I was very interested in World War II, and then when I was a teenager, I was interested in the 1950s, then the 1960s. When I got to the 1970s, I kind of lost interest and started going further back in time. Around the time I entered college, I had started watching silent films. I wasn't trying to be a hipster or anything, but I did like to go against the grain. But I guess I latched onto the 1920s because it was in such a strange position between the two biggest wars ever, and between the 1920s and World War II, the Great Depression made things look pretty, well, depressing. So the 1920s were this weird island surrounded by crazy stuff. In America, pop culture just exploded then, and they really knew how to push it, and I gotta say, it's still pretty enticing even today. So I guess that's what did it for me. What films from the era are your favorite? Like many people, I gravitate toward comedies. I love comedy from all throughout the 20th century, and I hadn't had a very high opinion of slapstick humor until I discovered Buster Keaton and Harold Lloyd. I had seen older Chaplin shorts, but the Keaton and Lloyd shorts and movies are what really did it for me. I think Keaton was the master of the short, and Lloyd was the master of the feature, so those will always be my first choices. I really like The Freshman from 1925. It's always high up on my list of favorite 1920s movies. Not only is it really funny, it also has a college theme, and 1920s college stuff is always interesting to me. I also really like Metropolis because, how can you not? I know those are pretty generic answers, but I have a long list of 1920s films I want to watch, but it's hard for me to watch full movies right now. It might sound a bit exaggerated, but my apartment here in Japan is really tiny, and I only have a desk chair, and it's very uncomfortable to sit in for a long time. I'll move back to the US in about a year and a half, so I hope to diversify my favorite movie list then. Are you into or have ever thought about getting into vintage fashion? I've been interested in it for many years, but I don't really like drawing attention to myself, and I don't want to stand out in public, so I've never really done it. If I was in a room with other people wearing vintage clothes, I would definitely join in, but I just don't want to stick out. Maybe we can start a convention or something someday so that no one will feel weird dressing up. Now that I have more disposable income, I might splurge on something vintage but not super obvious, like a coat or something. What is the weirdest thing you know about the 1920s? Okay, this is a piece of media rather than a weird event or something like that, so I hope that's alright. I've never mentioned this before in any of my videos, but I'll probably include it in the next random facts video. In the late 1920s, there was an adult cartoon supposedly made and screened in secret by a group of some of the best animators in the business at the time. It was titled Eveready Harton and Buried Treasure. And despite so many silent films being lost, this was surprisingly not one of them. But I really can't describe a lot of the cartoon without being demonetized, and pretty much the only thing I can show is the title card. What I can tell you is that if you're used to the innocence of vintage cartoons, this will come as a massive shock. I can't emphasize how inappropriate it is. Like, there are some very weird fetishes in it. If that's something you're not used to or can't handle, please don't watch it. I'm not trying to do reverse psychology, I swear. I really just don't want to be responsible for scarring anyone. Personally, I don't mind graphic content, and I thought it was really funny, partly because of the complete reversal of expectations for old cartoons. But it's perfectly understandable why some people want nothing to do with it. But anyway, it's extremely weird and not super well known, and it just goes to show what some men were actually thinking about in the 1920s. Would you be willing to do another Halloween-themed video? I want to do another installment of the Murders of the 1920s series, but the problem is that it would be instantly demonetized. All 3 of the older videos in that series have limited ads, unfortunately, which gives a tiny fraction of normal ad revenue. When I move back to the US, I want to set up a Patreon, and if I can get enough funding with that, then ad revenue wouldn't be much of a problem, and I can make some of the videos I've held off making for a while. Another idea I had for a Halloween video is casually going through Denison's Bogey Book, which has a lot of great illustrations of Halloween costumes, decorations, party games, and those kinds of things. But it won't be this year because I've been very busy. What is your name? For a few reasons, I don't really like to use my real name online, but on my Instagram page for this channel, I use the alias Harold Keaton, so I guess we can use that here on YouTube too. My real name isn't too common, I guess, so I'm a little worried about my privacy. If my name was just John or Nick or something, I probably wouldn't mind giving that out. What is your career? I've been working as an English teacher in Japan for about 4 years, and it's the first and only job I've ever had. And after I leave Japan, I can hopefully make YouTube my only job, at least temporarily while I get a master's degree. Without getting too personal, could you tell us a little about yourself? No. Nah, I'm just kidding. There's not really much to say, I guess. I'm originally from Texas, went to college in Michigan, then came to Japan to work. I've dabbled with a lot of hobbies, but history has always been the strongest one. And one interesting thing is that I collect a lot of things that I think are cool, like old diaries, letters, photo albums, and war stuff. I haven't been able to get many things for my collection like that in Japan, because people here just don't really care about them. But I want to use some of my YouTube money to buy more authentic 1920s things to feature in videos, especially things that tell a story. I can show you something small I got a while back, 2 programs from the Roxy Theater in New York, which, if you don't know, was the movie palace of the 1920s, and you can get a taste of what a matinee was like there. The movies being shown on these days were not big popular movies, but it was still a very grand show, and one of them features an article by Dorothy Parker, which is pretty cool in my opinion. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on the constant misrepresentation of 20s fashion. Yeah, the 1920s is misrepresented in so many ways, and it always seems like pretty much every woman in depictions of the 20s is the most stereotypical flapper with a skirt far shorter than average at the time. It's a weird assumption that everyone dressed like a young movie star, but it just goes to show the power of pop culture. It kind of reminds me how a lot of shows or movies overdo the slang from a time period. Like if something takes place in the 1950s, everyone sounds like Leave It to Beaver or something, as if that's a good representation of how most people actually spoke then. And for the 1920s, in virtually every depiction, it's young people dancing to jazz, drinking and smoking in a speakeasy or at some other kind of party. It's unfortunate too because a lot of the other outfits I see in magazines look really cool, so I wonder why people are still completely hung up on flapper dresses. I mean, there's certainly nothing wrong with the little black dress or anything, but it wasn't the only dress that existed then. I don't know much about the specifics of fashion of any time period, but if you want to hear someone more knowledgeable talk about it, you can watch this video from Karolina Zabroska. What are your other interests aside from the 1920s? My main one is music. I love to track the history of recorded music, so I have a massive collection of songs from all time periods in pretty much every genre. Most people organize their playlist by mood or genre, but I usually organize mine by time period, because time periods are my moods. For the past couple of years, I've been going through the music from my childhood period, but especially music that has no direct nostalgic value, songs that I missed out at the time for whatever reason, as well as songs from the early 90s, before I was born. I've really gotten into grunge and punk a lot more in the past few years, and now I can't stop. But I also love songs from all decades between the 20s and my childhood. But my least favorite decade for music is definitely the 80s, which I know will be an unpopular opinion. And aside from listening to music, I also play a little guitar. Not well, but I can play some fairly easy songs all the way through more or less. I've also written a bunch of original songs over the course of many years, but I mostly have only the vocal melodies and haven't added music. I've always wanted to be in a band, but I'm getting on in years now, so it probably won't happen. I also really like fiction writing as well, though I'm a bit out of practice now. But I've written quite a few short stories and have a number of half-finished novels. I'm also a big fan of old-time radio, and I definitely recommend it to anyone who likes old movies or TV shows. It's completely free if you use the Internet Archive, and the Old Time Radio Researchers Group pretty much always has the best quality audio. The late 1940s and early 1950s episodes of the Jack Benny program are legitimately some of the best pieces of entertainment I've ever experienced. I'm also a little obsessed with monkeys and apes, which is a bit different from my other interests. It's kind of hard to indulge this interest aside from reading books, so I don't think I can call it a hobby. But gibbons are the best animal, and you won't be able to convince me otherwise. If you could travel back in time, what event from the 1920s would you want to see unfold in real time? It's not really one single event, but watching the transition from silent to sound film would be really cool. I feel like it would be a bit frustrating for me to watch people and the industry just toss silent films aside so willy-nilly, but I would also feel excited. It would be sad to watch, but it would also be fun to look at everyone else's reactions, and have conversations with other people about it, and have a debate or something. When we hit the 2030s, will there be a 1930s channel? I'm definitely interested in doing a 1930s channel in the future, because if I could just make a new channel every 10 years, I'd never run out of content, and I can just keep doing this job forever. But in a job related to rapidly changing technology as well as entertainment, it's hard to say if something will come along and make YouTube content creation irrelevant, so I guess we'll just have to wait and see. What are your thoughts on AI and UFOs? Well, first I want to say that I am not an expert on either of these things and haven't done any research on them. But in regard to AI, it's hard to tell which path it will ultimately take. On one hand, I think it could be essential in solving serious issues that humans can't seem to ever solve by themselves, things like climate change, which may very well threaten our existence. However, it's very uncomfortable to imagine making something that is exponentially more intelligent than we could ever be, and it's even more uncomfortable not being able to tell the difference between what is real and what is AI generated. Maybe right now you can tell which is which, but the technology will only get better. And as with any technological development, humans will absolutely find a way to weaponize it. Personally, I'm pretty cynical about it and feel like there's a whole world of trouble ahead, but I want to be proven wrong. Now, regarding UFOs and aliens, I don't believe that aliens are tampering with Earth or anything like that. I like to think that it's statistically unlikely that we are the only intelligent beings in the universe considering how unimaginably big it is, but I don't necessarily think we've made contact with any yet. There are definitely non-alien explanations for a lot of UFO footage, especially in this world of advanced secret surveillance. We have to remember that UFOs do not necessarily mean aliens. It's been an acronym used by the military for a long time. If aliens do exist, it could be a similar situation to advanced AI technology. Would they help us, harm us, or just ignore us? I've always liked the Arthur C. Clarke quote, "Two possibilities exist. Either we are alone in the universe, or we are not. Both are equally terrifying." Who is your favorite 1920s pulp author? Well, I'm not that into pulp fiction, but I do really like H.P. Lovecraft stories. What I don't like about a lot of pulp is that the pacing is so fast and there's a lot of telling and not a lot of showing. But Lovecraft stories are a little bit different, and in more ways than that. The concepts of his stories are still pretty out there even today, so back then people must have been thinking, what is this guy on? And you just don't get that kind of impression with most other pulp authors. Of course, the science fiction pulps had a cool aesthetic, but I just feel like Lovecraft's ideas were on a whole nother level. What year specifically in the 1920s would you want to visit and why? It's gotta be 1927. That year was so fascinating, I had to make a video all about it a while back. There was Lindbergh's flight, the Dempsey-Tunney fight, Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig's home run race, CBS was established as the second radio network in the US, and I could see some of the most famous movies from that era like The Jazz Singer, Wings, It, Sunrise, Metropolis, and Seventh Heaven. I feel like 1927 was the climax of the 1920s in America, at least culturally speaking, and I would love to feel that excitement. What do you think is the biggest event from the 1920s that has changed our lives today? The first thing that comes to mind is the discovery of penicillin by Alexander Fleming in 1928. It's hard to emphasize how important this was, and it's very easy for us now to take antibiotics for granted, but they have saved us a lot of suffering. Do you have any favorite pieces of media from the 1920s? Mostly music comes to mind first, so I'll mention some of my favorite songs from the 20s. In no particular ranking, I like East St. Louis Toodaloo by Duke Ellington, West End Blues by Louis Armstrong, Black Bottom by Johnny Hamp, Old Man River by Paul Whiteman, and Get Out and Get Under the Moon by Annette Hanshaw. And while it's not my absolute favorite, one of the most interesting and unique songs recorded then was Dark Was the Night, Cold Was the Ground by Blind Willie Johnson. There's not even really lyrics, just him moaning low along with his slide guitar. But it has so much soul, and the music paired up with the title presents a very dark but folksy atmosphere, and I love it. You might call it edgy for the time. I really respect recording a song with such little chance of selling well, and I just thought it was a good opportunity to mention it. Do you collect anything from the 1920s? Yeah, I used to collect a lot of things from throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, but especially the World War II era, and I have some things from the 20s, and when I move back to the US, I want to get more of them. I don't have my collection physically with me right now, but sometime in the future I want to do a video going through all of them, especially some diaries I have. Now that I have spending money, I would love to buy a 1920s radio, even if it's just for decoration. Okay, we have 4 questions from this comment. What is your age? Where does your love of history come from? What are your personal favorite eras? And what reality of the 1920s do you think is most misrepresented today and why? I'm 27 right now, but a lot of people seem to think I sound much younger, which is weird because I feel much older. It's kind of a mystery where my love of history comes from because it's been part of my life since elementary school. Once I skipped some of my class in, I think, 3rd grade, and was standing just inside the entrance of a bathroom in my school reading a book about Benjamin Franklin until the school janitor found me and kicked me out. That might be one of the earliest connections I can think of, so maybe the interesting life of old Ben Franklin is what did it, but I'm not sure. My main interest spans from the 1910s to the 1960s, so roughly from World War I to the Vietnam War. But aside from the 1920s, my favorite decade is the 1950s. As enticing as surviving movies, music, pop culture, and educational videos make it out to be, I'm very aware that it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows, but it still fascinates me, all the good and all the bad. The music and movies from the 50s especially give me a warm, nostalgic sort of feeling inside that other time periods just don't do in quite the same way. And it was a very eventful time in American society. I don't really believe in labeling periods or eras as golden ages, but my perfect world would have the aesthetic of the over-idealized version of the 1950s that we all want to believe was real, but certain tweaks would have to be made to the society itself. Okay, so now the most misrepresented reality of the 1920s today. I guess I would say how the young middle class is usually overrepresented in many people's minds. Almost every time we see a depiction of the 1920s today or think about one, it's the stereotypical drunken jazz party in a speakeasy, or a Gatsby-esque party at some rich guy's house. I mean, it's not hard to see why that is. These are representations intended for entertainment, and people like fun, exciting things. But because there are far fewer depictions of farmers or immigrants or the working class, passive viewers almost start to forget that they even existed. I don't want to be a killjoy about it or anything, but it would be cool to see more variety. In recent years, there have been more 1920s media about Black America, and there's Killers of the Flower Moon, which tells a story about Native Americans, which is great, but there's more work to do. Personally, I think something about Appalachian people set in the 20s would be interesting. I'd especially like to see more nuanced critiques about the 1920s in modern depictions. And I guess all of that is part of the bigger trend of people thinking that the past was so much better than the present day, but it's definitely not that simple. And I think that's a good segue into this next question. After all your experiences researching for and doing videos for this channel, how do you honestly think it would be living in the 1920s? Of course, this always depends on what my situation would be. If, let's say, I picked a random lottery ticket that decided what country, race, or socioeconomic status I'd be thrown into, it's less likely compared to today that I would get a lucky draw. Living in a slum is an unpleasant experience in any time period, and there were more back then. But let's say I do get a lucky draw, and I'm a middle-class white man in a suburb of a big city in the US. I'll have quite a few modern amenities like toothpaste, deodorant, toilets, and toilet paper, although the toilet paper wasn't quite as smooth as now. The main downsides that come to mind are bigger things, like much lower safety standards, more crime, horrible pollution in dirty cities, and widespread racism and sexism and lots of discrimination. However, I also feel like I would personally benefit a lot by being forced to be more independent. I think there are a lot of crutches these days that can prevent someone from doing more things by themselves if they latch onto them. And I think that extra push could have some very positive and fundamental benefits for me, especially improving my confidence. Then, there was a lot of excitement and optimism in the 1920s, arguably more than we have now. There's so much doom and gloom about the future now, and I'm not saying whether it is or isn't warranted. But every time there's new technology or something, it seems like there's more worry than excitement. Whereas going back to radio, there was so much hype and excitement about it, and not really anything much worse than intrusive commercials and the wrong genre of music being played incessantly. But on yet another hand, being among other middle-class people then might actually drive me crazy. It was a time of intense commercialism, where people could often be very, very shallow and superficial, which might make dating an unbelievably frustrating experience if I stuck to that crowd, and similarly with friends. I mean, of course, we have plenty of shallow and superficial people now too, and I'm not too sure if that would be better or worse in the 1920s. As much as I want to idealize the 1920s, it's very hard to actually believe in that version of it. I'm not sure if I can choose with complete certainty whether or not it would actually be better than living in the current time. But I can definitely say that I would still love to time travel to the 1920s if possible, just to experience it. But yeah, it would be interesting to debate about whether or not it would be better to live in the 1920s if anyone wants to do that in the comments. Which do you prefer, Chaplin, Keaton, or Lloyd, and why? I thought someone might ask this question. My personal favorite is Buster Keaton. His shorts were a big reason why I got into silent films in the first place, and I laughed a lot more and a lot harder than when watching the older Chaplin shorts. And knowing that Keaton did all of his stunts, at least as far as I'm aware, he was an absolute mad lad. He was so dedicated to his craft that he nearly died multiple times. It's always a thrill to watch the side of that building fall on him, knowing that if he had stood only slightly off the mark, he would have been crushed to death. I also feel like he had the most elaborate gags that only a comic genius could design. I have the utmost respect for his skill and daring, and to this day, it still makes me mad that a bad contract prevented him from really pursuing his creativity, though I guess you could also argue that it could have saved his life from some stunt gone wrong. I like Chaplin and Lloyd films too, but Keaton is my man. At some point, I do want to make a video comparing the three of them because I think there's a lot to talk about. What are surprising events or facts from the 1920s that most people don't know about? Well, considering that my audience probably has more knowledge about the 1920s than the average person, I'm not sure how surprising these are, but when I first started looking into the 1920s, I was shocked to learn how truly horrific the 1927 Bath School disaster was. Well, it wasn't really a disaster, but a massacre. Please don't demonetize this video, YouTube. I feel like it gets a bit more attention now, but still not as much as you would expect. And another event that I had never heard of at all before I started this channel was the Wall Street bombing of 1920. I mean, for both of these events, there are plenty of articles about them, but paradoxically, most people seem to have never heard of them. And one fact that shocked me more than it probably should have was that Native Americans weren't allowed citizenship status until 1924, and I don't think that's a super well-known fact. How has researching the 1920s affected your view of life, and what have been your key takeaways? Questions like this are always interesting to think about. Looking further into the 1920s has made me realize that misunderstandings between the younger generation and the older generation happens time and time again, even though we often have a good laugh about older generational squabbles. It's like we never learn our lesson, and I feel like this is getting much worse in recent years. When I hear an adult complaining about the music of today or something like that, it often seems impossible for them to see that they and others in their generation were exactly the same when they were kids. A teenager in the 1950s whose parents criticized them for liking rock and roll grows up and then complains about their own kids' music and doesn't seem to realize the hypocrisy. You can trace that issue all the way back to jazz in the 1920s. Most older adults hated it and told jazz-loving young people that their music was terrible. Those young people then had kids who grew up to love bebop or rock and roll, and then they likely criticized that. I guess what I'm trying to say is that as someone who used to join in the moaning about kids these days despite barely being in my 20s, it has given me a more open mind about that kind of thing. And older people don't have to understand why young people like something, and they don't have to embrace it either. Just accept it, because teenagers will just ignore your protests anyway. But of course, it's also a good idea to have a healthy amount of suspicion if something looks especially fishy or harmful. But just remember, if you're always moaning about the new music of the youth or things they like in their culture, you will go down as a crotchety old fuddy-duddy in the history books. Do you think radio and the birth of consumer electronics drastically changed the culture of the 20s leading into the Depression? Well, for radio, for the casual observer at least, it's often mentioned a lot how important radio was, but details are often vague and/or sparse in general summaries, so tangible evidence for its importance remains somewhat niche, but it is available. I can really only speak to the US about this. Radio affected American society a lot in the 1920s, and I think one of, if not the biggest effect, was psychological. Its popularity absolutely exploded beginning in mid-1922 and continuing through to the end of the decade. According to a statistic I found on the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History website, by 1925, 19% of all households in the US had at least one radio, and by the end of the decade, that number had doubled. Radio gave people a very exciting new technology to keep them interested in its future possibilities, and was used very often in predictions about the future, which usually focuses on technological development in every generation. I think it can be compared to how atomic energy was pretty much always a part of future predictions in the 1950s. Almost immediately after radio became mainstream, talk of television followed, radio movies, radio-controlled vehicles, and seamless and instant communication with the rest of the world. It could contribute to entertainment, but also had endless practical possibilities. And all of a sudden, people could hear educational talks, politicians' speeches, and religious services in their living room. Because of that, I'm guessing it also had the effect of making the US, and really the world as a whole, seem much smaller very quickly. So maybe it's not tangible or measurable, but radio's effect on American society was huge. And while actual jazz might not have been the most popular music on the radio, it was still very popular, and radio definitely helped significantly to make the jazz age the jazz age. Never underestimate the influence musical movements can have on society. As for other consumer electronics, I don't really have any specific details, but they sure made housewives' jobs a lot easier if they could afford any or all of the variety of modern appliances, like refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, toasters, and hair dryers. So I'm not sure how much other consumer electronics affected 1920s society, but I doubt it would have been as drastic as radio. Why do you think animation from the 1930s gets more attention than animation from the 1920s? The vast majority of cartoons from the 20s were silent, and as silly as it might sound to 1920s fans like us, anything silent like that will probably never be as popular as the sound versions. Personally, I think Felix the Cat should be placed alongside Looney Tunes as some of the best and most clever animation ever made. But while everyone knows Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck and Mickey Mouse, not all that many people know about Felix the Cat. And if they do, it's pretty likely that they're more familiar with a later version of him, rather than the 1920s version. Everyone knows how popular Looney Tunes cartoons were in their time, but fewer people know that Felix was a sensation in his day. Steamboat Willie seems to mostly hold the torch for 1920s animation, and while I have nothing against Mickey, it would be nice if more people talked about Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. I think entertainment mediums that deprive us of one sense, such as silent film or radio shows, just get left in the dust. And while black and white movies and TV shows aren't nearly as popular as those in color, they're still somehow able to appeal to more people than silent film or radio, I think. This is something in the world that I would really like to change. I think we could all benefit from entertainment that takes away one of the senses, because it means people have to be more creative when making things for those formats, and it's better to have a wider variety. But anyway, that's just my personal theory, because it's definitely not just simply a lack of quality in 1920s animation. Alright, I guess I'll stop there. I'm sorry if I didn't answer your question, but I definitely couldn't answer all the ones submitted, and avoided simple yes-no questions because it would have gotten a bit repetitive if I had. But maybe we can do another Q&A video sometime again down the road, unless there aren't any more new questions. But until then, that's all for now, all you sheiks and gals out there, but stay tuned for more tales from the Jazz Age.